Go live, go live, go live, go live, go live, go live. Hello everyone, how are we all doing? Hello, let's see. Now, I'll position this to here because then you can all see a certain fluffy individual. Or I could just do that a bit. And then I can expand that out a bit more. And you can still see a fluffy individual. Isn't that good? Alright. Oh, God. That one came out, didn't it? Yeah, I was waiting for some people to start. The moment I start a live, you start moving. You do, don't you? Yeah. You just go, look, for the recorded video, I slept the entire way through. The moment it's live, you're going, hello, I'm awake. I'm here for pats. And preferably, if you want to all put, well, of course, as we know, we do Bravo Zulu for when you think things are done well. I think in this channel, shall we say DT if you think someone deserves a treat? Or should it be PT? Let's do it PT for the poodle and CT for the corgi. Although the corgi is currently on a diet, so no treats for him. But PT for the poodle getting treats. It is a stream on tour. Hello, Gokbag. You good? You good? You enjoying yourself? Yes, you are. You good. So, let's say hello to everyone. Hello, Renan. Hello, Mark Harkness. Hello, Frank Spadado. Hello, Michael Cooch. Hello, Peter Dawson. Hello, Seven Croto. Hello, John Shea. Hello, Paul Amos. By the way, just want to remember, the patron suggestions is live currently. Patron vote will begin on Sunday. Hello, Match Industrial. Sorry to hear about the stones. For the Fluffy who's had stones. You don't like the idea of a Fluffy having stones, do you? You don't. You don't like that idea at all. You are now hiding behind the slide. You're not happy with that? Well, I'm not moving the camera again for you. I'm not. I moved it earlier for you. You've got an entire double bed to yourself. That is enough of a privilege. You do not need an entire double bed to yourself. Hello, Jacob. Hello, Carl Spoke. Hello, DG40. Hello, Byron Newman. Hello, Nightscape. Hello, Steve Clark. Hello, David Golding. Hello, DeBrock. Hello, Leslie Mitchell. Hello, Gok Bay. I said earlier, but I'll say again. Hello, Black Maximus. And hello, everyone. How are you all doing today? How is everyone? Oh, good lord. I know. You like the idea of PT. There's a lot of people saying PT. Okay, PT. Puppy Tango. Okay. You see, the thing is, he's worked out that you will do this. He's worked out that you will all argue for him to get treats far more than I will allow him normally. We need signal flag emojis. I do need to work on the emojis. I think the more subscribers I get, the more emojis I can create on YouTube. So basically, not subscribers, the more members I get on the channel, the more emojis I can create. So basically, membership of the channel really does give emoji benefits. That's what I always tell people. Membership of the channel gives emoji benefits. The second edition is like to carry around. I'm glad it is. So the Christmas vids start Saturday next week. Christmas vids do start Saturday next week, I think. They do. Yes, they do. I started recording. They're all slowly being recorded and put together and put up, and yeah, it's going along. I need to record more. I haven't recorded enough this week, but there's been things going on. Going and looking at houses whilst trying to record videos causes fun things. Cool, Peter Dawson. You picked up from Bookshop on Tuesday. Seneca Nero, you have made me very happy. Unfortunately for me, I'm currently on water because I've run out of iron brew and milk. I'm having to drink water. It's just terrible. Just handed my first shot at being an assistant at a fencing club. That's cool. That is cool. I see Richards. So, you happy? Shall we take this down a bit so people can see your face a bit more? You happy? You enjoying life? You've moved forward. You decided you are going to be here. You're going to have a little bit of fun. Oh, hello. You're up again. You are just active today, aren't you? You really are. You're active. Hang on. Yeah. That's weird. Oh. I'm not sure why I just did the camera fun thing, but it's back. Yeah, it is hard times with time, Brownie. I tend to adjust the camera to an extent because I know most of you come actually to see him more than see me. And he thinks that. He definitely does believe that. He's absolutely certain of that fact, in fact, I would say. Fundamental belief of the poodle is that more people are here to see him than me. So. Hello. So. Today's video topic is thanks to a suggestion from Michael66. So thank you, Michael, and thank you for being in the chat. And it's Sydney strategy. When looking for a Far East Naval Base, what is Sydney, not Singapore? Now, we're going to start off with, there's already been a comment in the chat about this, so I can get into this straight away. From 96831, the chat at the comment was that I think he stated Sydney would be more practical than Singapore. Okay, that depends on your perspective. If you're talking logistically, if you're talking geographically, if you're talking strategically in terms of positions, no, Singapore beats it in every single way. If you're talking about its ability to control access and defense of both Australia and India, Singapore beats it in every single way. I'll be discussing the ways in which Sydney does beat Singapore, and I'll be getting through that during the live. But let it be known that the long patrol video for this topic is nearly 2 hours long and includes a lot of interesting information because it has to. So we come here for two things. Naval history from you and seeing the poodle. Seeing you is not on the list. I did guess that. So, without much further ado, let's get moving. First off, I have to say thank you to everyone. Thank you to everyone who's supporting the channel. Thank you to everyone who shares the videos, who subscribes to the channel, who likes the videos, who is a member of the channel, who's a patron, who buys the books. And there will soon be multiple books to buy. I will work on it. I will get it done. I'm starting to pick up my pace of work again down here, but the trouble is it's, as said, there's a lot of other things going on and moving around this month. So it's interesting, but we're getting there. Nice, everyone. We'll get into that one as we go on. But basically, none of this will be possible without your support. None of this will be possible without your support. And thank you for that. As I sometimes have to tell you, nice, everyone, if I jump and answer some of your questions now, then it will be answering it completely out of order for people. And the thing is, I have to explain certain concepts we're going through. So let's start off with what were the options. Paul Thomas, I thought Darwin would have been better. Darwin would be interesting, but you would have to build even more than you had to build at Singapore. Darwin is theoretically an interesting one, but you would have to build everything from pretty much scratch. So, let's start off with considering some of the background sources, and there are a few of them. There are a few. Now, I haven't listed them, but they are going to be listed very quickly in the description down below. These are the not book sources. Now these come, all of them, pretty much come from JSTOR. They are interesting. They are worth reading. And they are some of the parts of background that I have gone into for this topic because it needed to be gone into. It is a very broad topic, and the thing about alternate history and counterfactual history, etc., is it can teach us a lot about decisions that were made and why they were made if it's done properly. But it requires you to go and look at a lot of history, especially a lot of the arguments around history, and from people who you both agree with and disagree with. And I have enjoyed doing this tremendously for this topic. But I have spent a lot of time on it. And frankly, though, it's been rather useful because one of the interesting things I've recently acquired is because of this channel and because of your support, but also because of the joys of being a contract lecturer for universities and the way that can change, I have acquired my own JSTOR account in that I now pay the roughly $24 a month fee, so I can have it independently access JSTOR. And that's useful. That is useful. But it means I have access to these sources, so when I'm doing this topic, I can go and look at them, and I can go look through them and go, And there were a lot of interesting sources here. I haven't listed Hansard, which of course I've also gone into. I haven't listed some of the books I've gone into, and that's because some of them with me. There's a fair number with me. This one, of course, Far-Flung Lines, edited by Keith Nielsen and Greg Kennedy is with me. Did you hear the bang and decide you were something what was going on in the house? And of course, Warships After Washington by John Jordan. There's a few others in there as well I've been using, but those have been good starting points. Certainly good considerations. I would warn you that the Routledge one, last time I checked, was about £48 on Kindle. It's always an interesting scenario. I would say, though, before we get into it, go much further, nice to everyone, you've just put in the chat, realistically, had the British Empire been in a better position, they'd have done Singapore, Darwin, Sydney as naval bases. That's not in a better position, that's in a position where money is no problem and you've got infinite funding. That's a lovely position to have, but honestly, building up to full naval base standards, 3 such places, because you're basically building the equivalent of Plymouth/Gibraltar in the Far East from scratch. that's a major expense. Building 3 of those, that's a lot of money. You're talking probably the best part of £500 million at a time. That's a lot of money. I don't think I have my economic statistics book with me, but that would be a major part of British defence spending to be spending that much money on that. It would be a major part of government spending. It just isn't going to happen. Because, honestly, why do you need to build 3, other than just say you've built 3? So, these are some of the sources to go and look at, and they are interesting. One of the ones I found most interesting was the fact that there's a lot more American thinking going on about Singapore than there is necessarily British thinking going about Singapore. And there's a lot more American discussion of Singapore than British discussion of Singapore. It seems to me that Singapore becomes a bit of a bugbear at certain points with certain American audiences. Let me just check on something just quickly. Right. Yeah, well, it's, life is interesting sometimes. Life is interesting. And why were the Americans so obsessed with Singapore? Mostly because they wanted to do the same as Hawaii and they were trying to justify it. That's one of the things. The Americans, one reason they're complaining about Singapore so much. So when people go, oh, this is causing issues with the British. And then you look at it going, they're using, Singapore, and, that justifies investing in Hawaii. Oh, okay. Night to everyone. I will get into this and discuss this more with you, but I'm, in the nicest way, we're not derailing the topic to go after your questions at this current time. Because that does sometimes happen with your questions, but the trouble is, this has got 21 slides, and I've got internet access, which is occasionally variable. So I cannot guarantee I'm going to have the same endless hours that I normally do. So I'm just going to say no, but we'll get into that. I can see where you're coming from, but the trouble is, honestly, for the vulnerability of Singapore, you need to go back to the Singapore strategy videos I've done in the past on the Singapore strategy. Because Singapore wasn't that vulnerable. Singapore has a lot of defense and a lot of security going. It should be actually a lot more secure than it is. There are issues with the fall of Singapore. There are major issues with that, and there are major issues when you compare it to the 1920 scenario, where, of course, Indochina was French, rather than being occupied by the Japanese. So, yeah. So let's start off with discussing the Far East strategy and where it comes from, where it is. The Far East strategy is an interesting point. We have Rear Admiral Sir Herbert Richmond. Okay. Now, why is he an interesting one to quote? Because lots of people can find him to quote because he basically writes endlessly. The guy goes on to become chair of naval history at Cambridge University, and in one of the colleges of Cambridge, I forget which one he's in, post his naval career. He is a naval theorist, he loves to talk about it, he loves to do all sorts of things. But he is not exactly unbiased in his commentary. And I'll get into that. In this scenario, he says, he's the Commander-in-Chief East Indies Station. Please note East Indies Station, not China Station, East Indies, so this part. We are going to force Japan to surrender by cutting off her essential supplies. We cannot cut off her essential supplies until we defeat her fleet. We cannot defeat her fleet if we will not come out of fight. We shall force it to come out of fight by cutting off her essential supplies. He's basically ascribing the German situation to the Japanese. And this is an interesting argument for him to make, but basically, he's wrong. Japan is not Germany. Japan doesn't have the internal communications infrastructure which Germany does have. Now, the thing is, Japan doesn't have that, but also Germany is not surrounded by water. Germany is also able to import stuff through the Baltic. If ever the British had managed to make it into the Baltic, Germany would have fallen very quickly because of the amount of supplies which need to come through the Baltic. Especially from Sweden, neutral countries, which are imported from other countries. And yes, the British were cutting that off by pretty much buying it. This is what people often don't understand. The blockade of Germany is twofold. There is the, we're blocking of our ships. There's also the, we have a checkbook, we will pay you more scenario going on. A lot. Now, with Japan, Japan's in a very different situation. They are the other side of the world from pretty much anyone else who have stuff they need to get their supplies and resources from. Their fuel, etc. needs to be imported. Their food needs to be imported. All their goods are moved around their coast because they don't have internal supplies. And the Royal Navy's plan was pretty much to get a base close enough there that they could use their submarines to do the close blockade, have cruisers wandering around dealing with any escorts and vessels out hunting the British submarines, and then if when the Japanese are forced to come out of fight or die from starvation, then fight their fleet. That was the British scenario. Now, that's not simple to pull off, but it does work. And also, this is thinking in the 1920s. So please note, when people start coming back and go, ah, yes, but what about this system and that system? You're mostly often talking about bringing up 1940s ideas. Aircraft are not where they are in the 1920s as they will be in the late 1940s. And furthermore, if you consider the Japanese aviation industry, etc., and their defense industry in the 1920s, you could pull this off. In the 1930s, you can still pull it off. You do differently. It's going to be a lot more grinding work. And even in the 1940s, it's viable. It's not that dissimilar to the strategy the Americans were actually doing. The only thing is the Americans added on the idea of doing an actual invasion of Japan. If you look at what the Americans were doing with their submarine forces, that's pretty much the British strategy. Just the American one also includes a naval invasion. Frank Sparrow, I'd like to see, how would you rank the top 10 night fighting navies between World War I and World War II? Oh, that's a video in and of itself, isn't it? That is a video in and of itself. How are you? So, I'm kind of surprised the RN didn't go for a larger mine-laying submarine fleet for any potential war against Japan, considering how effective it was in World War I against British. They did, though. The British have fairly large, capable mine-laying submarines, but you also have to remember there's a distance. The German ones were mostly shorter-range coastal submarines. The British were looking at it going, we're going to have to be doing this mine-laying probably from Weihai Wei. Because again, if we go back to the strategy, how are they approaching? Well, honestly, the plan is to, broadly speaking, send their forces across here. Group them up together at Singapore. Singapore is going to be the theatre entry base. That's what Singapore is. So you build your fleet together. Then you push your fleet through the South China Sea. Do you have any resistance? Retake or relieve Hong Kong. Once you've achieved Hong Kong, then you push from Hong Kong to Weihai Wei. Once you get to Weihai Wei, from there you can do your operations off the coast of Japan. And whilst Britain and Japan do have a naval treaty, do have an alliance, up until the early 1920s, until 1921, the thing is, the British are not stupid. In that they can see where Japan can be going, and they also can see that it's not necessarily Japan will have a war with them, but Japan can have a war with America. And the thing is, Britain can't afford to not to be part of that war. So there are lots of issues going on with the strategy. Now, if I expand this a bit, you can see this a bit more. Because this is roughly what we're talking about in the 1920s. This is roughly what we're talking about in terms of the worldview. You see very quickly the differentials between the British, the Americans, the French, the Italians, and the Japanese, and the Germans. You also see the problems for the British, in that they're two of their major economies, as part of their empire, are the other side of the world from them, and are completely exposed. But a third of their major economies in the empire shares a massive two massive borders with the other problem. So the Britain strategically is in a very tricky place. They have issues all around them. And this is one of the reasons why they do go for the naval treaties, but also one of the reasons why they go for end up with the Singapore strategy they do. But it's not necessarily a sensible Singapore strategy. So, here becomes the issue. Where do you secure an empire the other side of the world? These are, broadly speaking, the options grouped into their stations. Now, Australia is also known as the Australia Station, so it didn't seem to make sense to include an Australia Station under brackets there, because that was kind of, Australia's part of the Australia Station. So we have India, East India Station. You could have Trincomalee, Madras, and Bombay. Those are your three options. The trouble is, the Indian government is really not keen. The Indian government is obsessed with British Indian Army. They are obsessed with being the jewel in the crown of empire, and they are certain that their army is the essential thing of empire, and therefore they do not like to get involved and split their effort on navies or air forces or anything else. And this causes fun throughout the 1920s and 30s. Honestly, the British senior defence staff in India are an interesting bunch of interesting people, and combined with some of the choices for governors of India, it was really, really interesting, and viceroys, really interesting. The Royal Navy had entire classes which were mine-laying submarines. Most of their submarines could launch them, but specifically you have the Grampus class, and you also have HMS Porpoise, which is sort of a testbed. But then you have the fact that quite a lot of the other submarines do have the ability to launch mines in various forms. And including, of course, there's the M3 wandering around, which also had mine laying capacity, and yeah, the Royal Navy has a fair number. What were the imperial ambitions in Southeast Asia for Europe in the 20s, especially if Japan didn't challenge them? Honestly, there aren't that many in terms of imperial ambitions. Most of the imperial ambitions in the 20s are status quo and consolidation post-World War I. That's what most of them are thinking about, and most nations are thinking about. Now, that's your problem with Trincomalee, Madras and Bombay. They are all equally lovely places, and honestly, Trincomalee is probably, personally, would have been my favourite for investing in. I have reasons for that, but it would have been my favourite. Because I think it's just that bit further back, and just that bit more protected. But, there are options. In terms of the Far East, in terms of the China station, we have Weihai Wei, of course, but that's pretty much Chinese. And the British are planning on using that for wartime, but that is far too close to Japan for peacetime. That will be overwhelmed and swamped in 5 minutes. There's no... But at one point, when they were talking about looking at the defence of that, they said, well, you know, if the British Indian Army is prepared to contribute basically an entire corps, we can probably hold it. But that's what you're talking about. Hong Kong is lovely, but it's got similar issues as Gibraltar in that it's got very small amounts of land. And putting a major fleet base there, again, you're going to be very close to Japan, and you've got a very long logistics line and a very long time to get there. Singapore, it's at a choke point. So you're going to have to build fortifications and protections there anyway to secure the choke point. So adding on fleet stuff, that's saving money because you're putting the defences you'd be putting in for a fleet there anyway. It's also nice and easy for everyone to get through, and if you can secure Singapore, then no one can interrupt the line of communications between India and Australia. They're going to be safe. Manila, no, Frank Spallo. Manila's not really... Well, it's not really of interest to the Royal Navy at this time. If the Americans were allied with them, they might use Manila as a springboard along which to move up their passageway up towards Japan, but if not, they're not going to worry about it. From Australia, what are the options? Well, there's Sydney, which is mentioned in the title and will be discussed. There's Darwin, which has already been mentioned in the chat. It's a nice northerly part. And there's also Perth. Let's see, what is so important about Brunei? Oil. A few other things as well, but principally that. Now, all these have differing options. You have the Australian government. They're probably happy to invest, but they're going to need to invest a lot of money to attract attention and attract support. Singapore is the perfect location from defense-wise. It also is far enough from Japan, they aren't going to get to it quickly. They really aren't. The idea they're going to racetrack to Japan in the 1920s from Japan to Singapore is just not going to make any sense. And honestly, it doesn't make any sense until you have the fall of French Indochina. That's the point. The whole point is Singapore is actually, if you think about it, can you consider there's the Philippines, which should probably be painted blue at this point, but are an iffy one, so I haven't painted them blue. But the Philippines are pretty much American. Indochina is French. And then you've got all the British Empire around it. Singapore should be secure. Singapore should be safe. The Philippines should not fall like it does, and French Indochina shouldn't fall like it does. Tashi Rochelle, Singapore is fine as long as you can defend it. Why was there no coherent plan for defence? There were coherent plans for defence, they just weren't implemented. There are actually things built, like defence positions for things like, key things like the reservoir, that just weren't, they didn't send any troops to because the staff command fell apart. But that, Tashi Rochelle, that's in a completely different video. I've done a video on Fall of Singapore. Frank's Water, does see how much space was there in Singapore for how large a fleet you could base there? You could build a base large enough to base the entire fleet there. So that's the important thing. You've got plenty of... Singapore is full of space. Now, interesting, Black Mars, so you bring up Canada, but that's not really the topic yet, but we will be talking about Canada in a second. So, Cody 85, Thailand should be painted a colour similar to Japan as they can ally them. Thailand weren't allied with them in the 1920s, okay? You have something different that happens early on, but this is the 1920s the colours are for. So no, Thailand is not the colour of Japan. Thailand at this point is probably closer to Britain than anyone else. Mainly because that's how they stopped the French invading, by threatening to bring the British. It works. So, we're going back in time from 1924 to 1921. We're going back to the Imperial Conference between Dominions. That's always a fun point to do. Now, this conference is interesting because you have the Prime Minister of Australia, Billy Hughes, there. You have the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Bill Massey, there, who both favoured a renewal of the Anglo-Japanese alliance. They did this because they felt the British Empire needed to have a reliable friend in the Pacific. They didn't feel the US were a reliable friend. They felt the late entry into World War I, and they also felt that the fact that the USA had tried to do things like the League of Nations and all sorts of things, and then immediately withdrawn from world affairs as soon as World War I was over, meant they weren't reliable. You can understand that to an extent. In contrast, you have this gentleman, Arthur Maynham, the Prime Minister of Canada, who... oh, good lord, he hated the Anglo-Japanese alliance. It was absolutely the worst thing ever, because in his mind, the Anglo-Japanese alliance was what was causing the Americans to invade Canada. Yeah. Even without a war, the Anglo-Japanese alliance was going to cause the Americans to invade Canada, because there was no way they were going to tolerate a Japanese ally being north of them. No way, no way, no way. So, you know, they're going to invade. And honestly, it's a victory for Canada in that they are so obstinate that the alliance is allowed to elapse. Now, there are, of course, British involvement in this, and there is a British political position going on there, because the British have worked out there is a small problem coming their way, as I've already alluded to. That Japan and America are going to end up fighting, because fundamentally they don't seem to understand each other, don't seem to be able to communicate, and they keep knocking heads. And America can't seem to get past its various Commodore Perry expeditions to Japan and its approach to Japan. Britain doesn't really understand that, because Britain has also done, as I've covered in various videos in the past, various nasty things to Japan, but managed to build up a decent relationship with them afterwards. Britain's not quite sure why America hasn't managed to do this. They seem to have built up a mutually antagonistic relationship at best. And this is the problem you have. And the British, thinking about that, go, right then, so if America fights Japan in the Far East, if they win, they dominate the Far East, and we can see a serious reduction in our power and presence in the Far East, losing all that economic advantage. And remember, whilst the world is technically capitalist at this time, they haven't been mercantilist for that, they haven't transitioned from mercantilist that long ago. They still have a healthy dose of the person who controls the resources and the people makes the money. And this is the issue. And then you have the fact that, well, in that scenario, if America and Japan end up fighting, and if America wins, Britain loses control of the Far East. If Japan wins, Britain loses control over the Far East. What does Britain do? Well, Britain has to join that fight. Do you join America or do you join Britain? Now, there are actually some who would argue you should join Japan. Do you join Japan or do you join Britain? America. Sorry, I said Britain or America. There are some who actually would argue you should join Japan. There are some who believe you should, mainly because of the reasons put up here. Japan was considered a reliable ally. Japan was considered a loyal ally. Japan had fought by Britain's side for the whole of World War I, pretty much. They had gone to the Tsingtao, or Qingdao, they'd taken that from the Germans. They'd sent ships sent anti-submarine warfare forces to Mediterranean to help fight in the Mediterranean. They had offered capital ships to the Grand Fleet after Jutland. All sorts of things the Japanese had done. And this is an issue. But, on the other side, America is another Anglophone nation. America has a lot of ties. Their government might be annoying and isolationist, but their people are connected. They're rich. They speak the same language. They espouse similar views. They intermarry. They're connected. There's a lot more ties. And honestly, you have the Canada scenario. Because whilst Britain is sure they can defend Australia and India and New Zealand from Japan, they're not sure they can defend Canada from America. So, Britain makes a choice. They start building a closer relationship with the Americans, and basically a lot of their war planning and a lot of this war plan you have to consider when you talk about this war plan. It's based also, there's a healthy dose of thinking that the Americans will also be coming across the Pacific. That the Japanese will be dealing with the British coming up from the South China Sea, and the Americans coming across the Pacific. And the idea for the British is if they get the Weihai Way first, they can then dictate strategy, because Weihai Way is going to be the critical base. The Americans aren't going to be able to do their operations and do similar operations from the Philippines. They're going to want to get close, and Weihai Way is going to be far better than any other option. And if you have the joint fleets operating from Weihai Way, that can win. So, this is the consideration. Now, Blackmore, were there any railroads lines connecting Singapore to the rest of mainland Malaysia during this time? I think, if I remember correctly, the Singapore railway station was opened in 1932. Hang on. They had a railway built in Singapore itself. In 1903, and the old railway crossing was built in 1932, I think. I'm not sure. Might be wrong. I think that might be the wrong bridge. It's always helpful when it comes up and you go, quickly check my notes for Singapore Railway Bridge, and I think I've got the wrong bridge. I think I've got the railway bridge for the naval yard. Let me check. Let me check. Let's do the whole checking of. I want to see where the railway goes. Second link bridge. The Yoho Causeway, if I remember correctly, is what I'm looking for. So when was that opened? That was completed in 1928. So the Yoho Singapore Causeway is built in 1928. And yeah, that has the railway and everything going on it. So, and the untapped potential of US homeland is a lot greater than the untapped potential of the Japanese homelands. True, but there again, that requires you having politicians who are prepared to tap it. The British weren't quite sure about the Americans on that front. There's all sorts of issues with Canadian Navy at this point. Anyway, so the point is the Imperial conferences have full-on debates and discussions about this. And full-on debates and discussions about the Far Eastern strategy and where a base should be. And whether or not the British are going to build a base. Because one of the things is that it's an important commitment to the Australians that such a base is built. The British building a base in the Far East to defend the Far East is a critical component of making the Empire and the forces there attractive. And the British do have to compete from now on. The British do realise that this is one of the things with the Commonwealth. It starts competing for its members early on. Because if you consider the Americans' perspective on the outside of this, and let's use the Americans, but there are a lot, most other countries fall in this. Depending on a paper's perspective, every time they hear about the debates going in an Imperial conference, in Imperial Defense, Imperial Defense Conference, like the one in 1921, they either report that this is just puppets mouthing dissent in order to look like they're independent, or they report it as the Empire's about to break up. In fact, one paper, I think, in America reported that Canada was so upset by what was going on in British defence circles and the Imperial Defence that they were going to leave the Empire and join the United States. I think that paper was possibly doing... I'm not sure what that paper was on. But it was an interesting thing to read. Now, here is the thing. We jump on a bit more. There was also opposition to old defence spending in the UK. This is quite a common one. Now, please note, I am bringing up Winston Churchill here. Why? Because he's the Chancellor of the Exchequer. But I'm also bringing up his cousin. Why am I bringing up the former Lord Lieutenant of Ireland and Churchill's cousin, Viscount Wimborne? Because Viscount Wimborne, well, apart from some sources describing him as Churchill's sock puppet, is a good, how do I put this, indicator of where the wind blows. The man is always ready to make a massive speech on the popular side of whatever is the popular position at the time. He changes his views like he changes his socks regularly, and depending on the smell. So, he starts off with this. I want to ask, what is the objective of this naval base at Singapore? What is its purpose, and against what danger is it designed? It is a new proposal on the party Admiralty. We had a testimony of Mr. Asquith in another place, i.e. the House of Commons, because he's in the House of Lords, that during all the years he presided over the Committee of Imperial Defence, the subject, although discussed, was never entertained by the committee. It is quite a new, comparatively new thing. Against what prospective enemy, against what danger in particular is this new work designed? The First Lord of the Admiralty, the speech to which I have referred, said that there is, in this course, no suggestion of any difficulties in relations with Japan. If Japan is excluded, it's difficult to see what particular peril threatens our interests in the Pacific. Knight 6831, you have managed to upset Nightbot. Now, let's consider that point of view from our weather flag friend. First off, he starts off by quoting Mr. Asquith. He's made a big thing about it being a new proposal. What danger is it designed? Okay. Anyone with half a brain can suggest, well, the Far East is at risk. There is not enough security there. It's an exposed position. We've spent the last 20-odd years concentrating our defences in the home waters and defending against the German threat and excluding threats elsewhere in the world on the basis that that was the primary threat. Now that threat's gone, we need to rebalance and make sure we're defending the rest of the empire. Okay, that's not difficult to work out, and honestly, a good defense is better than us. Is a good made to preserve peace by making it very difficult for people to take you out. Now, then he goes on to the testimony from Mr. Asquith. In another place, that during all the years he presided over the Committee of Imperial Defence, the subject, although discussed, was never entertained by the committee. Well, that's a bit of mealy-mouthness, because the fact it was discussed but never entertained suggests A, it came up multiple times. Because if you just said discussed but wasn't entertained, okay, that would mean once. Never entertained means it's come up a few times. And there can be lots of reasons why something's not being entertained. It could be because the primary threat is in Europe and you don't have the money to do both. It could be because, what's the need? There's no threat out there at that current time. It could be because, well, Australia already has its own battle cruiser. New Zealand has a battle cruiser, sort of, so we've gone with that policy. It could be because you weren't looking for the cornerstone of a free fleet plan to defend the wider empire. All those are scenarios. All those are the things which are potential. So, yeah. You're quoting Asquith and trying to infer he's saying one thing, when actually what he's saying is very different from what you're claiming. Now, after that, what prospective enemy? Well, it's kind of obvious, isn't it? They're not mentioning Japan. Japan's an ally at the current time, but they're not sure what Japan's going to be like in 20 years' time. And currently, you don't build infrastructure when you start a war. You want to have the infrastructure in place before the war begins. And that's the point. Are you securing this for the long term? Because even if you don't use this short term for this defense, even if you don't use it for defense there, the infrastructure you build is actually going to be useful to support infrastructure elsewhere. For example, let's say we build a big dockyard in Singapore that can repair capital ships and aircraft carriers and cruisers. Let's say we build that. We outfit it. We have all the supplies and all the facilities there. What happens in World War II when ship's damaged in the Mediterranean? Is it sent all the way around the Cape to America, or is it sent to Singapore? If you can do full repairs and upgrades, which is better to send a ship to? Across the Indian Ocean to Singapore, or around the Cape of Good Hope? which I'm sure is called the Cape of Good Hope because it's so lovely and everyone enjoys sailing around it, not because there's any rough patches there. But if you have a major industrial base at Singapore that can support and upgrade and support your defence and your infrastructure, it's a theatre entry logistics hub. That's going to help. It's something that can help both ways. It can help with operations in the Indian Ocean and in the Pacific. Jordan Newman, okay, excuse my interference, but I gotta ask, what is the difference between a committee discussing a topic and committee entertaining a topic? Okay, the difference between a committee discussing and entertaining a topic is a committee is discussing it is they are considering it as relevant information. If they're entertaining it, that means that they are actioning on it. So, in discussing means they are looking at potential options for plans and things to put in there, but they are deferring it until it is until it's a viable option for them to pursue, or a necessary option to pursue, because they've got other criteria. I can't think why, in the middle of fighting World War One, when Asquith is chairing the Committee of Imperial Defence, he is not going, you know what we need to do is now build a major base in Singapore. Because that's what you do in the middle of fighting World War One. You build a major base in Singapore. Hello. You decided to lick my hand. Okay. Now, the thing is, Winston Churchill starts out by making actually what is the best case for it in peacetime. The absolute best case for it in peacetime. Because in roughly 1921-22, he says this. One of the links in our internet imperial communications and one of the greatest guarantees we can give to Australian dominions that the British Empire is united. It is linked together, and we will proceed to their assistance if they need our aid. This is talking about the Singapore base. They are not cut off. The Empire is not cut in half, and they are not cut off from the British Empire. I look on it as a gateway which enables us to keep in touch with Australia and the South Pacific, and also a gateway which can be kept closed to a very large extent, and will ensure a very great measure of security in the Indian Ocean, in the event of dangers arriving in China's water with Japan. This is what he understands in 1921. But after he's been charged with exchequer for a few years, he writes this. If he had foreseen that the decision to develop a base at Singapore would be used as a gigantic excuse for building up armaments, and that this country would be invited to pour our money with a view to conducting war at the other end of the world, he would never have agreed to develop this base. Honestly, Churchill basically pivots constantly between underestimating the Japanese and thinking they'd never attack Britain because Britain's so powerful. Some points he even throws up the idea that Britain can't fight Japan because if Japan's so powerful we'd lose. And at other times he comes in with, well, there'll never be a war because the Japanese would never fight us, and there's never going to be a war, so we don't need it. He's a constant jumping along of these things, and honestly, you are talking a very strong family in terms of their political connections and political instincts. They are good. They are good windsocks of the direction of politics at the time. And he, as Chancellor, doesn't want to spend money. Do you have to do that on camera? That's not really nice, is it? And you've been licking me. I don't know. Now, Frank's .c, what about Perth? I think I got into Perth, but honestly, if we go back here, because I think I did cover that. But basically, Perth and Darwin, as lovely as they are, you would have to invest so much to put that stuff there. You would have to invest so much to make them work. Now, Honestly, there are all sorts of things mobilised against this. Is it breaking the treaty? It's perfidious Albion. If we consider Viscount Wimborne, at one point he mutters in his long speech, which you can find in Hansard. So if you look at Hansard for the 5th of June 1923, you'll find Wimborne's speech. At one point it says, well, because by treaty we are not allowed to put defences at Hong Kong, we're just moving next door to Singapore. Singapore is apparently next door to Hong Kong. I'm not sure what happens to the South China Sea in this scenario, but apparently they're not there. I presume if Singapore is equivalently next door to Hong Kong, then Britain and France must be in the same front room together. What do you think? You don't care much longer, you're getting padded. Okay. Yeah, I know, you're always happy with a bed. So, that's what's going internally in the UK. Oh, I think you're asking for something again. Oh yeah, PTs are appearing. You spotted the PTs before I did. Seriously. If you don't eat your dinner, the family are going to tell me that I've been doing something naughty. Or worry you're ill. Ay, caramba. Now, it's of course not a violation of the treaty, but they're just saying it's perfidious Albion. We're being perfidious Albion. You have to remember that. Yeah. Look, they're making a political case because they want to spend money on other things. You have to remember, we like to believe that there was this mythical time when politicians had a long view. They've never had a long-term view. They've always had a view as far as the next election. Whatever form that election takes. There are two reasons you can put forward this. You can put forward the charitable reason. They worry about winning the next election because if they don't win it, the other side does, and they think they'll do a better job at running the country than the other side, so they have to keep on the right side to get the necessary votes. And they are worried about social spending, etc., because if they don't spend enough, they're worried that Labour's going to get the support and get in, and they're going to lose the support of the hard-working working class, or the proper working class, or the various reasons they come up with it for it. Or you could go for the less than charitable perspective, which is politicians worry about winning next election because if they lose it, then they lose their power and influence, the things that make them special. Honestly, I would say the British debate in this period is most interestingly categorized when we compare it to the quality of the defense debate going on inside defense about strategy. Because if you look at the political debate, there is almost a differential between the vast number of lords and MPs who seem to have fought on the Western Front, who are still very Eurocentric and almost treat everything like it's European distances. And then there's the debate going on in defence, where it's very much, well, the Army and the Air Force going, the Far East of the Navy's area because we can't operate over those distances. That's it. That's literally their reasoning for why it's the Navy's area. They can't operate over those distances. You just enjoy looking at yourself in the video, don't you? You're actually... Excuse me a second. Let me just do this. He keeps staring directly at the camera. Yeah. Thank you. This is going to be a fun time period for me, isn't it? With you in here every live. You're looking forward to it. I'm thinking I'm going to get bruises. Most politicians have issues. So, why did they go with Singapore, and how do we change this to go with Australia? Well, they go with Singapore because of treaty, location, and cost sharing. Treaty-wise, it's far enough away, it's not included and covered by the treaty, so they can do what they need to. Location. It is, I think that might be Tesco's finally arriving. I might actually get some iron brew. Yay! Now, location. Singapore, of course, is a choke point, one of the critical maritime choke points. It is also ideally positioned between India and Australia, so it secures the trade going back and forth between them, moving of goods. It allows the British to basically turn the Indian Ocean into their own waters. And that's useful. And I know you can hear the Tesco's man, and I know Zebedee getting to him first, but you know, you're not allowed to go to Tesco's man. Because no, you're not allowed to, because of what you did last time to Tesco's man. You nicked a lollipop out of his pocket. You're not allowed to go to Tesco's man. No. You nick things out of their pockets, you do not get to go and see them. Okay. And cost sharing. The the Malaysian government and Singaporean governments basically gave a huge amount of stuff to the British to build it. They gave money and they also gave land. They were very invested in getting that infrastructure that came with that naval base. It was the equivalent of what you get today with some of the sports stadiums, far more in America than you do in the UK. You know, for the NFL, etc. You're always seeing articles about it, how the various cities offer quite so much money and quite so much incentives to these big teams to come to their cities. Well, it's the same with getting a naval base. Singapore bends over backwards. So, how do we change this to go with Australia? That's going to have an impact on everything as it goes forward. The treaty can't change. We're not going to change the treaty. We can't change geography because changing either of those things changes too much and moves us too far away from history. If you're changing the treaty, then you only change the treaty. If you're not changing the treaty, then you don't change the treaty at all. And so therefore we have to go to the third option. And if the Australian government offers more, well, let's put it this way. Let's think this through. Churchill's main objection to the Singapore naval base was paying for it. If Australia are offering to pay for everything and support it so that he has to put in a lot less, he'll happily jump on that. So will a lot of the people who don't want to spend money but get the base. Then if you consider the people who are worried about winding up Japan, well, honestly, it's that much further away from Japan, so surely that shouldn't wind up Japan. And it's just putting a base in Australia, which is British territory anyway. And finally, you have the people who want a base. Well, this way they get their base. It's not where they wanted to be, but they get a base. It works. It works. That's good. The difference of a politician and statesman is in part the willingness to look at the effects of their policies beyond their time and position. That is definitely one of the bigger differences. Oh, they do have finer points, particularly philosophy debates, but mostly, this one isn't allowed near Tesco's because he nicks stuff out of their pockets. Because one Tesco's man once turned up with dog biscuits in his pockets, and ever since, he tries to rifle them. He's a tea leaf. Oh, Iron Brew's arrived! Thank you. Iron brews are. It's my iron brew, not yours. You're not getting any. We're not giving you iron brew. You're also not getting my wafers. Nope, you're not. So, with all that in mind, it becomes a likely scenario. But if you're going to change to Australia from Singapore, there are going to be issues. There are going to be big issues. That's good. It's not stealing, it's paying for not being cute and not eating legs. You are cute. Although, I have to say, the cutest image we've had all this trip was when Zebedee, and I didn't have my phone with me because I was in the hot tub. This place has one. I have videos to record for some reason. And but I didn't have the video camera with me because I was just basically relaxing, and which really annoyed me because he actually ran up the steps, jumped in, and swam around. It was quite cute. I did clean it out for them afterwards. Don't worry. Anyway, what changes if we go for an Australia base strategy? Well, Nelson and Rodney don't. You see, the strategy comes through in 1924. And these are both ordered in 1922 and starting in 1922. So they're not getting changed. They're not changing. And that's a good thing. That is a good thing. It gives us some constants to work with. It gives us some positions to work from. But there are things which are going to change. You're going to have to deal with some fundamentals that change for the Royal Navy going into World War II. Some big fundamentals. Distances. Here's the thing. If I expand this a second, you can see what I mean. The distance roughly from the Suez to Singapore is 5,365 nautical miles, give or take. At 16 knots, which is the theoretical cruising speed of these lovely creatures, who can do theoretically 7,000 nautical miles at 16 knots, well, they can achieve that in 2 weeks. 2 weeks sailing can get them there. Halve that distance, fill up some fuel at Cam Bay and Adu Atoll, and you can get there even quicker if you're prepared to burn fuel like no tomorrow. But to get to Sydney, that's 9,644 nautical miles. That's 25 days at 16 knots. And you can see the route. I've got them stopping for fuel at Cam Bay. I've got them stopping for fuel at Adu Atoll. But then it comes up to the Dutch East Indies, and there's nowhere for them to stop for fuel. They're going to have to refuel at sea, if they refuel at this point. Which means you're going to need to have the fast fleet oilers built earlier on. Which is interesting. But they're going to need to be using those before they can fuel up, probably in Papua New Guinea area, and then get to Sydney. So instead of you having roughly 2 refuelings between Suez and Singapore, you are looking at more than likely 4 to get to Sydney. So that's a lot more infrastructure you have to put in place. A lot more fuel you have to build. And you are now roughly 4,300 nautical miles further away from the action. Remember, Singapore is your theatre entry point. Your theatre entry base is now a lot further away from the action. Now, they can refuel in Colombo, Sri Lanka. As you can see on the earlier map, the battle cruisers and aircraft carriers were going to refuel at Trincomalee. But that is one of the options. That's also going to add on extra range because that's actually a longer route. I'd add, if you use the extra ton, if you use the water storage points as fuel storage, then you have to clean them out from the salt water that's used for bilge water and bilge water and feed water, and have to clean it out and make sure it's okay before you put the fuel in, because otherwise, if that water mixes with the fuel, that can cause you problems. That can contaminate your fuel and make it bad. So yeah, there are things you can do, but fundamentally, yeah, those things aren't going to change. The things that are going to change are what's going to be built afterwards. Because think about it from this perspective. A tribal class destroyer is capable of going at 5,700 nautical miles for 15 knots. 15 knots, and able to do that. 5,700 nautical miles. Hang on, the difference from Suez to Singapore, 5,365 nautical miles. Okay, well, that's just a coincidence, isn't it? J-class, 5,500 nautical miles at 15 knots. And so the Ks and the Ms. The Js and the Ks, and the Ns. The L and the Ms. 5,500 nautical miles at 15 knots. For the O&P class, which were the more emergency destroyers, built when you're fighting a war in Europe, it's 3,850 nautical miles at 20 knots, or 5,500 nautical miles at 15 knots. What is happening here? Well, it's quite simple. What becomes the defining characteristic for the Royal Navy that they require in terms of endurance of their ships? That they can do Suez to Singapore. Suez to Singapore is what they're working out from. Remember, the Royal Navy relies on its basing strategy, on it having bases around the world, to give it the ability to maneuver around the world. That means you need to be able to get between the bases. The thing is, they've got bases, so you only have to do half the route, and then you can get refueled. But the thing is, just in case anything happens to those bases, so you can still reinforce Singapore, you can still get there. That's so lovely, Furball. 15 knots, 5,500 nautical miles, you can make that trip. Now, I would agree the Torres Strait is not exactly an easy passage. But the Cape of Good Hope is really not fun. Wouldn't they run aground passing those? No, they can do that. They can do that route. You have to remember this is done with a very simple calculator, but I did base it on ship routes, and yeah, they can do that route. It's also it's a yellow line, okay, that comes up automatically to make my life a little bit easier. Now, this means that when we're talking about this one, though, you suddenly have to make that range 10,000 nautical miles. Nautical miles. So when you're designing ships, the designing characteristic is going to be 10,000 nautical miles. That's their criteria they're going to start using. So by the time we're dealing with the destroyers being built in the 1930s, the cruisers being built in the 1930s, and let's be honest, the County class are probably going to be the first ones to feel this. Because the County class cruisers are built from, the first ones are laid down in 1924. So they're going to be ones built to define us. They're built with the ability to do 8,000 nautical miles at 10 knots, or 2,300 nautical miles at 30 knots. In which case, they can do the run, this run, between, and with one fueling point, stop-off point at either Trincomalee or Abdu Atoll, at roughly 25 knots. That's great. But hang on, if you need to do this run rather than that run, sorry. If you need to do, this was weird for me, this one, rather than this one, then you need to start thinking through and going, okay, what do we do? How do we do this? Well, the first thing you do is go, right then, our Candy-class cruisers are going to have a longer range. So if they do 2,300 nautical miles at 30 knots, they're going to need to do roughly 4,000 to 5,000 nautical miles at that. You're going to need to increase their range dramatically in order to be able to do this, because you need to be able to make that run. So 10,000 nautical miles at least 16 knots or 18 knots is what they're going to be looking at for cruisers, and 15 knots for destroyers. And that's going to affect every single design. Now, this is going to have consequences that you could really be interesting, because one of the factors that goes into the British with high pressure steam, the really high pressure stuff, the British go, we don't need that level of engine efficiency, so we can afford to avoid that and just concentrate our research in other areas and build our technology up in other areas and leave that to one side. Because we don't need it, because we have the bases and we can run through them. Now, fuel and feed water are not included in standard displacement. They're not. So you can have them. But remember, any fuel you have has to be put in fuel tanks, has to be included in hull space. Same with water, which all takes up metal and all takes up weight. Has to be protected. Will you stop eating your own fur? Sorry. He's been having a fun day. You haven't coughed at all day, and then I start a video and you start coughing and doing all sorts of things. Are you trying to get sympathy for more biscuits? Yeah, the way you're looking at me now, I think you are. I am strongly suspicious of you, Poodle. Strongly suspicious. You're far too smart for your own fluffy good. Now, if this happens, as said, suddenly the British require more efficiency for their fuel. So high pressure steam is back on. High pressure boilers are going to be developed. And the thing is, the British might get into them early. Because the British have that large maritime infrastructure. They have that large maritime industry. And you must remember, they do actually start earlier with the investment than the Americans do. And the thing is, this is where you could see a differential. Because whilst you can't change, broadly speaking, a lot of Nelson and Rodney's design, it's fixed. And by 1924, it is completely fixed. But if you start with high pressure steam boilers, which are even more energy efficient, and you start developing those in 1924 because you need them for the range of your county class cruisers, well, that's going to affect your upgrades of your battleship program, isn't it? In the 1930s. If you've developed high pressure steam so you can get your cruisers to do what you need them to do, and you can do it theoretically in this period, well, it becomes highly interesting. It becomes highly intriguing. Now, I think they go high pressure steam rather than diesel engines because, as useful as diesels are, they don't give you the same options for high speed. High pressure steam can give you both the high speed the Royal Navy wants and the engine efficiency. Plus, the Royal Navy has a lot of people who are already in steam, whereas they don't know how to convert over to diesel. We're talking, it's when you get to the sort of the 600 psi rather than 450 to 500. Roughly. Roughly. There are differentiating points and people get into that. So I don't want to get into that debate too much, but yes, you could be seeing all sorts of fun things. He's now gone to sleep. He's given up. Jacob, the merchant ships I work on generally designed for 10,000 nautical miles. They take 1,000 metric tons of fuel to do that at 14 knots. Mm-hmm. It's going to have an impact on the Royal Navy. It's going to have an impact on World War II. This would have, because consequence of this strategy. This is the standard range. Think about it from the point of view of the Atlantic campaign or the Mediterranean campaign. If you have the Royal Navy operating on higher efficiency boilers, A, they get more out of the fuel they already have, and they already have copious amounts of fuel. But B, you could well be talking about, as we've already discussed, 28 knot has been discussed in the chat, 28 knot Queen Elizabeth class. You could be talking about some very, very interesting modifications being made to Nelson and Rodney. You could be talking, well, again, without having a third shaft, it's still difficult to see them getting much faster. But that depends. Are they prepared to risk shearing the shafts off to get to Scharnhorst and Gneisenau? And honestly, think about what Renown could do. Because Renown, if she gets high pressure boilers as part of her upgrade, we could be talking about a 36 knot ship. She might not just be able to match Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, she might be able to overtake them during the Norway battle. That's a scary prospect. Now, it would not be enough weight savings to get the KGV's 4 quad turrets, but it could change them in other ways, and I'll get into that in a second. I will get into that and discuss that in a second. It's fun. I would still say Hood was designed already for 36 knots, so I'd say she probably still would get upgraded when she gets upgraded. Honestly, if Hood gets upgraded, they probably don't increase her boilers to go faster. They probably reduce the boilers, keep the speed the same, and... well, she was 32 knots officially, wasn't she? 32 knots officially. Just like Nelson and Rodney were... just like Nelson and Rodney were officially 23 knots. And the Renown class were officially 32 knots as well. I love the brush. But the thing is, Hood would probably be about the same speed, kept as roughly the same speed as Renown class, but you would free up tonnage for more armor protection if you did the upgrade. So, my point is, existing tech now is 33,500 in stat. You can increase stand displacement to increase fuel capacity. Considering they are allowed 1,500 tons, that would allow you to increase fuel capacity anyway, because they're allowed up to 35,000 tons. And if you did add in high pressure boilers, you could probably give them an all sorts of interesting range. But honestly, it would depend on how much work you're prepared to do, because one of the really interesting things with the nail rods is, thanks to that design, if you think about it, these are all the magazines, guns, and all this section forward, and the engines are back there, and shafts are all back there. So it's actually a slightly more straightforward job to modify a nail rod hull. And there is part of me which wonders whether you could add in all those things. If you were adding in high pressure engine, high pressure steam boilers and etc. Whether the weight savings combined with other things would be enough that you could maybe get a third turbine and shaft and maybe get them up to 28 knots. I don't know on that one. But let's go off that to Sydney. Well, you have Garden Island Naval Base and Cockatoo Island Naval Dockyard. I don't think you change this split. I don't think you suddenly get one new super base built. I think they continue on with this. I think they turn the naval base into a massive naval area. Probably fit in some dry docks of things like destroyers there. But mostly that's going to be a massive set of wharfs. And this is going to be an interesting scenario because it could affect some of the commercial areas around them by taking space away. But what they could do is design them that in peacetime they can be used as commercial wharfs, and in wartime transitioned over to military wharfs, over naval wharfs. That would certainly be something they could possibly put in. Add in Cockatoo Island Naval Dockyard, well, that's going to have the big changes. And the thing is, if the Australians are prepared to fund it, that's going to be a really big differential. It's going to have multiple dry docks for capital ships and carriers. Long enough to accommodate HMS Hood. Okay? So you're going to have to take the largest ship that they could be asked to accommodate, and that's going to be the standing point for what you're going to build there. And you're probably going to need 2 or 3 of them. Now, why am I saying you're going to need 2 or 3 of those? Well, so you see, you have a small problem. There are an extra 4,000 odd nautical miles between you and Singapore. So that's 4,000 nautical miles. Replacement ships have to go to get to the front line extra, and damaged ships have to go to get back to you. Which means there's a lot of that means you've got more ships to maintain the ones you need at the front line. You need to fight in a battle, because the whole point of a theatre entry base is that you're the theatre entry point. That beyond you is the war, behind you is peace, and so you are the stopping point at which ships come back and they get repaired. And the thing is, you can say in the Singapore one, the idea was to send them off from Singapore to either go to Bombay, Madras, to go to Sydney, to go to Perth, to go to Trincomalee, to go back to the UK. Yes, that was part of the strategy. But the moment you started building in Australia, there's going to be a differential here, because you've got a lot more infrastructure and industry. You've got a lot more space to put in. You've got a lot more level of security. And if you've got the Australian government pushing and financing this, that's the way to finance it would be to finance a rather large industrial base. Now, this has impacts throughout lots of options in World War II. For starters, do you need the ships to go from the Mediterranean fleet to America to get repaired? Instead, they can go to Sydney. So that can then have consequences for sea, etc., which we'll get into later. The more they invest, though, the more complicated it becomes for Britain, and it would force something else. It would force the establishment, in order for Britain to be able to be secure in this and able to control and influence it, they would have to establish some kind of combined joint command structure for the Far East. They would have to find a way to link together Australia, New Zealand, China, and the East Indies under the same command structure. So probably what they would do is they leave all the station commanders in charge. But they would have to put out a new admiral, and it would have to be an admiral because it's going to be a naval area taking command of naval stations, as new Commander-in-Chief, British Empire Forces Far East. Something like that would have to be set up. And it would have to be a joint command with the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy all in there. It would have to be set up. And it would have to probably be led by an Admiral of the Fleet, which is going to cause its own issues. Because if it's led by an Admiral of the Fleet, you've got 2 scenarios. This sort of posting is either so political that you want someone who's been First Sea Lord to go to it. But the trouble is, if you're sending someone who's a former First Sea Lord, they are how do I put this, going to turn this into a very political position and maybe not listen to the First Sea Lord. Or you're going to be sending someone who is a prospective First Sea Lord. This post will take over from the Mediterranean fleet as being the shining light through which prospective First Sea Lords pass to be anointed and become the First Sea Lord. Now, this is going to add on to it. But the big thing about such a scenario coming to be in the 1920s and 1930s, which would probably be the late 1920s, early 1930s it would come to be, is you would have possibly as much as 20 years, maybe as 10 years, of joint command staff work, of people having to work together. I'm not saying that's going to fix a huge amount of problems for the British in terms of getting their armed forces to coordinate together, but it might at least get them to have built a common framework to work together. So it might stop things like, the good example is 4C, where the air staff are trying to communicate that there's no strike aircraft available, so they say there's no air support available, and the Navy takes that as being there's no air support at all available, which means there's no fighters available as well as strike aircraft. But actually what the air staff mean is fighters are of course available, because of course they're available. No one sends ships out unsupported without fighters. But we don't have strike aircraft available. Well, the thing is, if you have a staff that's been working together, they'll have a set of procedures will be built that will have been adopted across the forces, which will work that sort of thing out. It will also have, by its very nature, caused something of a fusion of defence policy in the Far East. Because the moment you have someone who's so senior that they are coordinating all these things, and they're dealing with all the politicians on a regular basis, and sort of things like that, they will become the acknowledged defence expert. Whoever's holding that role will be the defence expert in the Far East. So all the various governor-generals and prime ministers will want to run their policies past them to get their golden seal of approval. And that is what probably will create all sorts of fun things. Now, go back to this. There are some questions going on. Yes, in the Cocktail Island was upgraded in the 1930s to handle a KGV. No, I don't think it can handle Hood. I think it could do that. They only had one dry dock there that could do it. Does an extreme range narrow move the needle on foreign battleship design? Depends how much of it the British emit. Again, it's how much the British emit. You have to remember that we are talking about a navy which used water for armour, which had fuel tanks which... Well, let's put it this way. There's the amount of fuel an aircraft carrier can carry in the Royal Navy as declared. And there's the amount of native fuel it ends up carrying seemingly in World War II. And there are rumours that some of the tanks were opened, cleaned, and suddenly became fuel tanks. Those are strong rumours. I have the idea that the Royal Navy was completely honest in this period is... The Royal Navy didn't so much... They never told an abject lie, but they were quite happy to confuse the issue in a way which benefited them. And I think that's the best you can expect from any Navy in that scenario. Hello, Waller's Ghost. Thank you for the point about the KGVs in the 1930s and the Cockatoo Island dock. And auxiliary floating dry docks would have been turning up anyway. They were probably you would have seen some turning up in Sydney itself to reinforce Sydney, but there was one in Singapore, and they probably have been moving them up with their plans were always to move them up with the fleet. That's what mobile naval bases were about. Mobile naval basing units were about moving the fleet forward and taking those bases back and re-establishing Hong Kong, taking and re-establishing Weihai Wei. Just look, someone should have formulated a question on air support differently or checked twice. Well, you'd think so, but for the Royal Navy, when they ask, is air support available, if they're told no, air support is not available, they think that means there's no air support. They didn't think that meant no, there's no strike aircraft available. It just didn't seem to them, but the RAF were operating on a differentiating command. And it just wasn't understood. The really interesting thing is that sort of the RAF weren't operating on that same command principle in home, or at home it was handled between the Admiralty and the Air Ministry, so it got sorted out because it was the level at which they communicated. And in the Mediterranean Fleet, it got sorted out because Cunningham had a habit of sitting on people if they didn't give him the response he wanted. The trouble is the Far East is a different command structure. As I've said before, the Far East has many issues in 1941, not least of which is the fact that the British forces have pretty much sent off their A's and B teams to war, and they're trying to train up their C teams and their D teams in the less hostile environments and the peaceful environments that they can, using them as deterrent forces, and that's not necessarily got them ready. As I mentioned, the Wallsend Slipway and engineering company working on high pressure boilers. There's lots of people working on high pressure boilers in the UK. So if the British government had gone that route, they could have done. So, Mike, saying you have no air support available makes sense if you're only used to working ground troops. Exactly. Because the thing that ground troops are interested in sort of air support is people providing strike. But the Navy is interested in air support in terms of the air defence. It makes sense. They're not bad people. That's what happened. Anyway. So, here's the joyous thing that I knew was going to come up. Someone was going to ask me about 15-inch guns, and the odds are you need them for both Singapore and Sydney. Which is interesting. If you have them going to both Singapore and Sydney, that's going to need you to consider building more elsewhere. You might even put some at Gibraltar at this point. Because if you have them, you'll go to defend Singapore and Sydney. There's going to be questions of why aren't they defending Gibraltar? Why aren't they defending Malta? Why aren't they defending... The thing is, when you're at Singapore only, they're a special thing for Singapore because it's a naval base and a choke point. The reason you need them for Sydney is to defend what is going to be your critical naval base for the Far East, because no one's going to give you the money to build multiple naval bases, and even if you did, you're still going to need to defend them all with 15-inch guns because they're a critical naval base. And you also need the 15-inch guns for the choke point that is Singapore, so you can make the straits as difficult as possible for enemy capital ships to pass through, so you can block off the Indian Ocean. So that means 15-inch guns become far more widespread, far more quickly. And that means the British are going to be building a lot of 15-inch guns in this period. So they might go with 16-inch guns. They might just keep building the guns which they're building for Nelson and Rodney. That is the option. But they might well go with the 15-inch guns because they have those, and they're also building and maintaining those. So they could well go with 15-inch guns. Now think about that and an impact on World War II. Because if Gibraltar has 15-inch guns in it, that adds to Gibraltar's security, but also makes certain passages of certain things very interesting. If Malta has 15-inch guns on it, that makes any invasion of Malta even more of an interesting prospect. And it gives an extra layer of defence around them. And if you have them both at Singapore and Sydney, the effects are there. But does the 14-inch gun look less appealing? Well, we'll get into that. The 15-inch guns, if they're placed all over the place, again, if there's more of them, that actually will make it cheaper to put them in Singapore. They'll make them cheaper to put them in elsewhere. And it'll make them cheaper to put in infrastructure. You'll probably also, think about this, if you're establishing a major base in Sydney, it's going to be defended by 15-inch guns and all these things. What might also get established in Sydney? A stockpile of 15-inch shells? Yes. And one in Singapore. There might even be a full maintenance facility, maybe even a production facility for such shells put into Australia. Because it's not as if Australia doesn't have the materials needed to make these guns and these shells. You could make the shells in Australia. You probably couldn't make the guns, but you could make the shells in Australia. sure, Mike, you could probably end up with Singapore being a literal Gibraltar of the East rather than the more vague idea that we put stuff in Malaya. More than likely, Singapore does end up being actually more secure in this scenario. Because, again, the thing is, the moment you have to have that command structure, that person in charge, what are they going to turn around to the government and say? Well, you know, I'm in charge, this. And the thing is, because it's a joint posting, where they're in charge of British Empire forces, it's not like the person posted to Pearl Harbor, Richmond. It is. It's Admiral Richmond, isn't it? Who was the one who was sent. Yeah, Richmond K. No, that's not that one. Oh, what's it? Is he sent on Richmond? The Admiral before. Okay. Okay, this is just going to annoy me if I don't look it up. Just going to look it up because that just makes my life easier to do. Richardson. Why was I calling him Richmond? Well, I suppose I'm so far. But yes, it's not like James Richardson, who is sent home because he's telling the White House that they're being idiots, or Kimmel, who can be easily blamed. It's a case of, if he's saying it, if we want to replace, if he's saying that our defence is weak and that it needs to be done, if we replace him and don't do it, then Australia and New Zealand and India are gonna get upset with us. So suddenly you need to do something. Thanks, my kindness, my good. It was Richardson, not Richmond. Now, this is going to be. This is the sort of thing. This is the problem. If they turn around and go, well, actually, Singapore is not properly defended, and we need to have some proper defences there, and it needs to be defended to defend the choke point. It does need to be a Gibraltar. Then it becomes an issue. You know, you have created, basically, in terms of political importance, and this is why I think the British would create it, but then they would realise very quickly they've made a problem for themselves, is the equivalent is the Viceroy of India. The Viceroy of India has always been, in the British Empire, a very powerful position. They basically ran British foreign policy in the Far East. They basically were the British government in the Far East for many, many years. And even in this period, the Viceroy of India is incredibly powerful. Well, you've now created a de facto, not Viceroy, because they don't have civilian power, but Admiralissimo in charge of the East Indies, Australia, China, and New Zealand stations. That person is pretty much the equivalent of a, as far as the naval force in British are concerned. They're going to have to be an admiral of the fleet to be senior enough. Now, I would say, before any of you go too far ahead, just ponder this one. In World War II, if the Philippines falls, MacArthur will be retreating back towards Australia. When MacArthur arrives, who's going to be Commander-in-Chief Southwest Pacific? Him, or the person who is Supreme Commander British Empire Forces South Pacific, in Far East, who's a 5-star admiral and probably knows Nimitz at this point, and probably known to Roosevelt, who doesn't like MacArthur. Who do you think Roosevelt's going to pick to be in charge? As Sean Macker said, I just realised there is a distinct possibility MacArthur only becomes basically an American army commander rather than a theatre commander. Yes, because there's already going to be a theatre command set up. So when you set up ABDA command, the British get the theatre command, or rather the British Empire gets the theatre command. That changes a lot of fun things. Also, it becomes interesting as, who do you think would be in that post? And that is a question which I would love people... I'm going to ask people to put... And I'd love to see your comments on who you think would actually be in that post as that 5-star admiral in 1941. The thing is, though, Sydney will need to be defended as a whole. And this is going to change some things. One, I think having a naval base there and having all these senior officers there, etc., in this senior command post means that they're going to have to change the infrastructure links between Sydney and Canberra. I mean, that railway is going to have work. And the railway station at Canberra is going to have work. It just is. Okay? That railway station at Canberra, I speak to you honestly as someone who is passionate about railways. I'm not sure who hurt Australia to produce that particular station at Canberra. It is full of lovely people. It is a box. Honestly, when I got off it, I had the honest impression that I was arriving at... I didn't think even a village station. There are village stations which are bigger and nicer and more grandiose looking in the UK than that. It was sort of a case of, what is this? We've arrived. Have we? This is Canberra? Okay. You'll need, in the nicest way, that would have to change. That would have to be changed. Mountbatten wasn't a 5-star, and definitely wasn't a 5-star in 1941, Steve Clark. It would have to, and Percival... Not that it wouldn't be in charge. It would be a naval post. If the Far East Command is set up in this period, it would be a confirmed naval posting. I do think one of the consequences would be the Army and Air Force would seek to establish their own similar postings in various theatres. I wouldn't be surprised if the Middle East has an Air Force commander, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Army tries to set up a command somewhere else. Probably the Army sets up a command in Africa. So there'll be the Combined Forces Command. There'll be the Combined British Empire Forces Africa Command, which would be an army officer. The Middle East would be an Air Force officer. And as Michael Widger knows, if the Med Fleet is no longer a gateway to First Sea Lord, does the CNC Med Fleet become CNC Far East? Well, yes, because it would seem to, because, let's be honest, the CNC Far East is not going to be a seagoing command. They're a 5-star admiral, they're going to be commanding a theatre. They are going to have senior admirals beneath them. So basically, they probably have a wartime scenario where the CNC China station would become the admiral commander, the fleet commander, the admiral in charge of the fleet. You probably have the Rear Admiral East Indies would probably be a Vice Admiral, would probably be second in command. The Rear, the Rear Admiral East Indies would probably actually become the destroyer, Rear Admiral destroyers. The Australia's Admiral, who's the Australia Station Admiral, and who's the Australian, would probably become Fleet second in command. And I'm not sure where New Zealand would slot into it, but they would probably have some position as well. You're looking at it, the command of the Far East would have to be a 5-star Admiral of the Fleet. So, Stephen Richards, Somerville's too junior. Somerville is not senior enough to be this. We're talking 5 stars, so we're talking Turret, we're talking Lord Cork and Ori, we're talking all sorts of people, but you have to look at the Admirals of Fleets in the late 1930s to figure out who it could be. Now, defense of Sydney as a whole would have to change, because Sydney's a major city. Sydney's a major population. And for Australia, it's also one of their major economic hubs. So if you've got a major defence hub, it becomes a major target. So that means you're going to have to think about defence, which means the Royal Australian Air Force is probably going to have to get into fighters a lot earlier. They're going to have to get into radar systems a lot earlier. honestly, probably when you're building chain home, you'll also get something built in Australia, which could have an interesting consequence of starting up a radar manufacturing industry in Australia at the same time. The thing is, you have to remember, part of the troubles about Singapore and the offset with Australia is that Singapore, you don't have the space to really establish much of a manufacturing industry in that time period quickly enough around it. You don't have the resources, you don't have the people, you don't have the technical people, the population, etc. to support it. You do in Australia. We're talking about who are holding that rank in roughly the 1930s. So John Cunningham, I don't think in Somerville, they are both get it a lot later. They get it later. Tovey the same. So you're probably talking about, well, Forbes, possibly. He and Cunningham are both for about the same time. Pound gets Admiral Fleet. Blackhouse dies in 1939. Pound, of course, dies in 1943. Earl of Cork and Orry. John Kelly died in 36. Turret lives till 1951. Chatfield could have been it. Frederick Field. He was First Sea Lord 1930 to 1933, so probably not, but he is an option. And of course, there's also Roger Keyes, and technically Sir Osmond Brock, who's still alive to 1947, and Sir Henry Oliver. Amazing enough, Henry Oliver was old by that point. So you have a few admirals of the fleet who are potential options. My suspicion is it would be Turret or Keyes. Turret or Keyes are the two I think would be the options. And either one of those would absolutely dispatch MacArthur with absolute ferocity, because they are both political animals in their own way as well. Hello, Wade. You know, did the Australians have the home chain? The Australians did set up radar, yes, but they didn't have their own home chain that early on. They were getting things, but the thing is, those things, they're all going to be more accelerated when you've got this combined infrastructure going there. Sure, I mean, the one that the powers that be would want to groom first would be Cunningham, but he would probably... Well, the thing is, he might be in the Mediterranean fleet, but it might be the idea that he would jump from the Mediterranean fleet to the Far East and then go to the First Sea Lord. There are lots of interesting senior officers available. So defence of Sydney as a whole becomes an issue, and that's going to drive a lot of defence debate in terms of Australia. That's going to probably they're going to want to have long-range maritime patrol, which might mean they order Catalinas or something earlier. Pretty much the people will be changing over every 4 to 5 years. So you would probably every 3 to 4 years you would have a changeover. If not, 4 to 5 years at the most. 3 to 4 years probably normal. 3 to 4 years is the normal for a post like this. So if you set it up in 1928, then by 1940 you're on your third officer in that post. By 1941 you're in your fourth officer, and they've just started out there. I think that the reason that all comes about is because the moment you have this taking place in Australia, you need to set up that joint command structure. When you've got it set up in a British-run colony, like Singapore or Trincomalee in Ceylon, or modern-day Sri Lanka as it's called, they would need to be, then the British automatically take ascendancy. But the moment you're in Australia, you have to have a joint command structure because all the facilities are technically Australian, especially if the Australians are investing it. So to coordinate these things and to get the necessary political control and influence, you need to have that joint structure set up and agreed. Sure, there's also the possibility that the deputy commander would be someone in a position of quite authority, say someone who's highly competent, but also a seawork, say Somerville. Quite potential. There's quite potential that Somerville will be sent out there, especially after assisting with all the operations which have gone on for Dunkirk. He might well be sent out there. Well, you're a radar expert. Go and set up the radar stuff out there. He might have already been out there. Let's be honest. He's a Royal Navy's radar and radio expert, and he's retiring for his bad health. And the nicest way, the senior commander out there might well go, that's Somerville, gentlemen. Instead of him having to retire, why doesn't he come out here and have a post on the beach with me in Australia and get his health back together? How's that sound? Come out to Sydney, Somerville. Bring your wife. Bring the family. We'll get you up to health. Oh, Scott, if they were going to need to build a lot of industry and infrastructure, would Adelaide have been a better choice? Further away from theatre, but more space, much more space. Probably not, because the harbour at Sydney is very good and defensible. So yeah, but also you have to remember, there's already Cockatoo Island, there's already Garden Island, there's already quite a lot of stuff to build from. So Adelaide, I can see your point, but no. I was considering putting forward the idea of Brisbane, but again, it didn't really make as much sense. I went with the ideas they were considering at the time rather than the ones I would like to see added in. Now, we're at slide 14 of 21, which tells you how long this particular presentation is. Ship design impacts. Well, you see, the King George V class, having a range of 15,600 nautical miles at 10 knots, doesn't really help them. That is a nice long range. It can get them there, but it ain't going to get them there quickly enough. Because let's be honest, at 16 knots, we're talking 25 days. At 10 knots, no thank you. So, I've already been over, I think. High pressure steam comes about with the counties at this point because they need the range. They need the endurance to get there. Well, what else is going to come out? Well, if you're building a King George V class and you're building it for 10,000 nautical miles steaming, you're going to want to build it slightly less beamy. At which point, you've got an issue. You're going to need to want to put in triple turrets. Well, do you go 14 or 15 inch? If you've been building 15 inch guns and doing all this work with 15 inch guns, you might well have gone with a political thing of trying to get the treaty limits to lower them to 15 inch rather than 14 inch. Which does benefit Britain anyway. And so you could well have a King George V class come in, where the British are building to their proposed treaty standard, but they're 15 inch gunships and they've got 3 triple turrets. 3 15-inch, three triple 15-inch guns, and therefore they're built to a narrower beam. Because if you build the King George V to a narrower beam, still be on the same length, but you can actually get a more efficient hull going through the water. Now, if you want to build them a little bit longer, you can then accommodate fuel, etc. But you've got that efficiency of that slightly longer, slightly narrower hull for getting through the water. It's not going to be as manoeuvrable as the King George V, but it's going to be faster and more efficient for the longer range cruising. And remember, that's more important now because the range has changed. Your range differential has changed from being over 5,365 nautical miles, so 5,500, 5,700 nautical miles as being the deciding point, to being a range differential of roughly 9,644 nautical miles, which means it's roughly 10,000 nautical miles, which means you need better. Now, I don't think you end up with an F3 King George V. I would love that, but I don't think so. I think you end up with 2 triples forward and a triple aft. My coach, if the CNC Far East is always RN, presuming Deputy Theatre Commander would rotate between the Army, RAF for political reasons. Michael Cooch, if you think about it, the CNC Far East, the deputy commander would have to be would probably have to be Australian. So the commander would be British, the deputy commander would be Australian. There would be an army commander, there would be an army land forces commander underneath them, theatre land forces commander, theatre air forces commander, and probably a theatre naval forces commander. But the Far East, the CNC, would be a 5-star admiral. And so then you have a whole load of 4 stars below them. And they'd all have to be co-located in Sydney. It'd be great fun. Now, pretty much at that point, you also have other design impacts. You're going to have impacts I've already discussed on destroyers, but you're going to have impacts on aircraft carriers. Now, for both of them, and IO2's already jumped on this. Hello, IO2. IO2's jumped on the 5.25 might also be less dangerous at larger diameter, which might lead to 4.5 or 4.7 inch twin dual-purpose mounts being used. Honestly, I could see a lot of things like that going in. I could see them going for slightly narrow, trying to get the most out of a slightly narrower beam. And I think the 4.5 inch guns on the carriers could well be fitted to the King George V's. So I do think they might be more likely to be fitted. Now, the 5.25 is not necessarily a bad gun, and that would free up more turrets for Didos, so they might get more rapid production on those. But the 4.5s could well be what are fitted to the slimmed down King George V's. They'd be good ships. They'd be useful ships. Aircraft carriers would also have to be longer ranged. Pretty much if you go through every single Royal Navy ship in this period, and you look at their ranges and their specs, well, the range of the Illustrious class, this is 10,700 nautical miles at 10 knots. That's not going to be good enough for this kind of operation. And 10,000 nautical miles is going to be what they're going to be working for. So every single thing will be different. But before people start thinking this is unusual for me to talk about this, have a look at the Royal Navy ships currently. If you look at the ones prior to 1982, there's a different distance differential going on. Because the Royal Navy always works out when it's designing ships, as most navies do, on what is the range of their biggest leap. The Royal Navy's biggest leap that they plan on doing is the Falklands, so pretty much every single one of the Royal Navy's ships has their range and settings worked out in terms of how long and how quickly at what speed they can get to the Falkland Islands on their internal fuel. That's what there's been since 1982. Prior to that, it was actually crossing the Atlantic. So, prior to that, in the World War II, run up to World War II period, the thing was distance from Suez to Singapore. So, at this point, the distance becomes Suez to Sydney. That's going to affect every single level of design. And the developments in high-pressure boilers and turbines probably won't have much of an impact on jet engines, but it will have an impact on the ships. Because, again, if you've got a slightly narrower, slightly longer, slightly with higher pressure boilers in them King George V, you might be talking about a 30-knot ship. And again, think about that. If King George V can do 30 knots, and have 9 15-inch guns, there are lots of criteria which start to come after that point. The odds are 9 15-inch guns. Well, the triple turrets on the thing about the Nell rods is that their triple turrets work quite well. The issue people often have is with choices made for their guns, the 16-inch shell, and the shells fitted in their guns. Well, if you consider the 15 inches available, and you've got those, so you've got a good gun, you might have gone upgraded to 15-inch 50. if you have the 50-inch 50 or the 50-inch 45, which was being looked at as the option compared to the 14-inch gun, if you've developed that, and you've got that on a triple, you've got 9 of those, that turret's probably going to be about as rock solid as the Royal Navy can build a brand new gun and turret system. In that, the odds of it having much wrong with it, or certainly having any issues by the time Prince of Wales is launched and is being commissioned, is very low. They'll mostly be worked out by King George V. In which case, you have a very different scenario starting to take place in certain actions and certain events. Shamak, it's probably that by 1941 the Army Commander Far East will be Australian, since the Aussies had something like 12 divisions by that time. Quite well, right, possible. You know, a lot of the senior officers out there could be Australian New Zealanders. It could well be that the Air Force Commander in Far East is New Zealander. Alright, I think I'm being called. I'm going to check. I'll be back in a second. Sorry. You stay. Hello? Oh, you were the one calling me, were you? Hello?
Debbie, come here.
Okay, I'll let you say hello to everyone, and then I'll take you back to Sissy. Come on. You're supposed to be looking after Mummy. I have a Raleigh following me as well. I'm still alive. Oh, aren't you going back with your mommy? No, you decided you were going to stay with Papa. Okay. So it appears we have a changing in the fluffy guard. We've had a changing in the fluffy guard. Alright. Alright. So. Could Narrows be fitted with a 50 gun turret? Potentially, but that would be a lot of effort for not much gain. The Poodle went off to decide to go and take over another double bed and sit between Mummy and Sissy, my mum and sister. Sorry, I was looking into doggy voice, wasn't I? Yeah, you're just enjoying being patted. They believe you should be having treats. You're not supposed to have human treats. The treats I've got at the moment, because they're going to make you podgy, aren't you? Yes, the corgi has arrived. Right, so. You're going to crawl around the bed now. So, with all this, we've been talking about the strategy of the Americans and the Brits. We've been talking about discussions of the Australians and the various internal politics going on. What we haven't mentioned is the strategy of Japan. What are you off to? And Japan will have a strategy. They will. They'll have to have one. But the discussion could be quite long and quite inclusive. You have your play. Now, if you're Japan, what do you do? How do you deal with this? I'd say you have a choice very quickly on if you go for a Pearl Harbor strike on the Americans or a Sydney strike on the British. There is going to be a differential. Hey! Excuse me a second. No. Down. Out. That was naughty. Basically I need a towel for the bed. I'll sort it out in a bit though. Yeah. No treats for the corgi after doing that, no. So, for Japan, for Japan, the strategy becomes what do they do in terms of Pearl Harbor or Sydney, which they attack first. Well, Sydney has probably not got the major fleet in it. Sydney's probably got the ships which have been sent out to be repaired and maintained in it. So Pearl Harbor's still going to be the primary strike. Pearl Harbor is going to be the primary focus. Little ceiling shower. I'm just going to cover things up for a second.
I know.
Right. I'll do all that in a second. Hey, caramba. Never work with children or animals live, do they say? Oh, well. Now, the R's and the Q's in this situation will need to be upgraded, but we'll talk about them in a second. Strategy Japan is probably going to start off with attack Pearl Harbor. And then instead of Operation C and attack into the Indian Ocean, they're probably going to focus on attack south. Because if they don't come and try and neutralize Sydney at some point, they're going to be in trouble. And it can say, what about their attacks on Malaysia again? Well, that becomes again a problem. Let's say they do the Malaysia and they go for Singapore. There's a very different problem for them. Force C is not going to be like it was historically. It's not going to be a rapidly deployed force at the end of a logistics line. So the logistics line is going to be Sydney, which is going to have a far more larger infrastructure base than it had previously had. But than Singapore had. But B, and the more important point of all this, it's probably going to be composed differently. Because as I've talked about lots of times in this, infrastructure is going to be different. The shipyards and docks facilities there in Sydney are going to be very different than the ones they historically had and the ones compared to Singapore had. So that means, to my mind, any ships which are damaged in the Mediterranean, i.e. Illustrious, Formidable, Indomitable sort of available but not damaged, Warspite, a few other ships which are damaged at various points, could well have ended up, instead of going to America, going to Australia. Especially as that would then give you a theoretical force in the Far East for deterrence, and I could see a senior CNC organising such a thing, whilst not having you actually commit major forces. But that means Force Z will be the major will be a very different criteria than Renown and Repulse, than Repulse and Prince of Wales. Sorry, I'm still distracted thinking about the corgi. He hasn't ever done that before, and he just decides to do that live on video. I mean, oh, please don't. He's wet the floor when he was a puppy, but actually wetting a bed? Good lord. I'll fix it. Yeah, I do believe that. So it's a different scenario. The fleet's going to be different. The firepower involved is going to be different. The formation involved is going to be different. There will probably be an aircraft carrier there, at least one, potentially two. Because potentially if they have enough facilities there, they've had enough reinforcing themselves. There's also a differential going on, because if you consider the invasion of Malaya, if it takes place as it did historically on the 8th of December 1941, any forces coming from Sydney, if they're based in Sydney, are 11 days sail at 18 knots away. 11 days sail is... I think honestly it was probably him being upset at me for him not being allowed the biscuits. But we'll leave that to one side. 11 days a day sail is a long time. That's going to change things. You've also got the difference in command structure. You've got Malaya and Singapore under the command of a ground forces commander, but there's going to be a senior ground forces commander watching him. So instead of having Percival going, I don't know what I'm doing, there's going to be someone behind him going, what the frick are you doing? Take a minute, calm down, let's work this out. You're going to have a commander-in-chief who's going to be watching overhead, looking at his intelligence briefings. You're going to have coordination between the various forces, because it's been established for over a decade, if not nearly 2, by this point. And they've got 11 days. Now, yes, they could go faster, use up more fuel. They will probably have had to have more fast oilers built. The British have fast oilers. The British just don't build a lot of them because they don't really need them. They know their view is they only need fast oilers for the short range bit between whatever the nearest base is and where their fleet is, and they have lots of bases. They need lots of slow oilers to move oil around between those bases efficiently. That's a differential. That is the differential. Now, I think, therefore, you have a difference. Because if you consider, if the British are coming from Sydney, if they have a carrier with them, and I think they have at least one, I reckon they probably have not... I doubt if they have Prince of Wales and Repulse with them. I wouldn't be surprised if they had different ships with them. Ships which are coming out of repair and damage at this point. Which probably includes things like Warspite, etc. New Zealand will be part of all these structures and will be involved in it, and probably their cruiser force will be part of it. But also, if you think about it, any force coming from Sydney will be collecting forces it goes through. So it'll be collecting Dutch forces. It'll be collecting other forces which are deployed in other points through Southeast Asia as it moves up. So the force which arrives will probably be a far more well-rounded task force than a couple of capital ships, a battle cruiser, unmodernized battle cruiser, and a battleship, fast battleship which has issues. And some destroyers. It's going to be cruisers. It's going to be a carrier. It's going to be a couple of capital ships, at least. It's going to be destroyers combined together. And by that point, if we consider by historically, they would be getting there about about the 18th, 19th of December, when the Japanese were by that point on the west coast of Malay Peninsula, heading down towards Singapore. Now, if you have some battleships and aircraft carriers turning up at that point, you have organic air defense for the task force that can coordinate with local land, so you're not going to have the same issues as 4C run into by a long stretch. I doubt you'd have a couple of Ark Royals, Steve Richards. They're not going to have a couple of Ark Royals because that's not part of the British doctrine to have those. And also, I think Ark Royals and Illustriouses would all be slightly different in this scenario. So it might not even be the Ark Royal and Illustrious class. They might be all the modified class because of, again, that range necessarily. But you probably still only have the single Ark Royal, but it's whether she's still available at this point. Because remember, Ark Royal historically was sunk. So I haven't included Ark Royal in this scenario because I haven't changed that part of history. The Ark Royal, whatever she is still sunk at this point. So it'll be probably HMS Illustrious. Now, maybe HMS Formidable and HMS Illustrious. Maybe both of them. Hopefully they don't have the same incident of bashing into each other like they did going out of the American dockyard. But the thing is, with a carrier, with those couple of battleships going up the coast, they could seriously shred the Japanese on the coast. That amount of firepower turning up on the coast road of Malay Peninsula could cause severe trouble for the Japanese. And it would be a very problematic scenario for them in terms of their ability to defend and intercept them, because they'd be at the maximum range of their aircraft. So, what happens with Malaya? Well, potentially it actually doesn't fall, because also potentially if you have a CNC Far East, they might do things like, why were we sending a brigade of Canadians to Hong Kong? Why are we sending a brigade to here? Why are we sending? And they'll be organising things and keeping things better together. So the summary gets interesting because Ian Hamill concluded in his video, it's not video, his journal article, which I was reading. The years 1924 to 29 in particular were an exceptionally peaceful and optimistic era in international relations, and such a risk seemed eminently reasonable. The Foreign Office predictions about the situation in the Far East were a reflection of the situation. Even when Japan, beset by the World Economic Depression, abandoned its liberal regime and embarked on a policy of aggression by advancing into Manchuria in 1931, a period of exactly 10 years was elapsed before it struck directly at British interests. Nevertheless, during the troubled years of the 1930s, those responsible for British foreign and defence policies were severely hindered by the legacy of their 20s, and all their actions were determined by the necessarily slow pace at which the deficiencies which had been allowed to develop could be put right. Winston Churchill was, after all, a man very conscious of historical perspective, and it is in this context that his feelings at the time of the fall of Singapore and after may have included recollections of his role in the years 1924 to 29. Now, saying that to one side, I would say the interesting thing for me was the biggest change that this scenario brought through was the command structure. I tried to work it through without such a command structure being included, and it just didn't make sense. It didn't work for anyone. Because the Australians are not like Singapore. They're far too proud to allow the British to set up a massive defence and take over control of their defences. They're not going to do that. So it needs to be found a way to coordinate together and work together. And the only way you can do that is if you have, theoretically, Australia station as its independent station, but all coordinated under a theatre command. Which changes things. So, as the Japanese scraping together a better fleet to protect the army, you have to presume the Japanese have such a fleet available, but also, if we go back to this scenario, if the Royal Navy is heading up the west coast of the Malay Peninsula, where is the Japanese Navy coming from? And how many submarines are they running in to get there? Because this is before they've got control of the Malay Peninsula. They've not got Singapore, they've not got Rabaul at this point. So that's not going to be a practical scenario for them. They're on the west coast, coming down the west coast, or the south coast in some regard. You might argue of this, of the Malay Peninsula, not the north and east coast. So I would add also going into that, the command structure was really the interesting thing. It was really the very, very interesting thing. And it gave a lot of differential points. A lot of points of development and a lot of points to consider. Because once you added it in, that improved a lot. And honestly, the big thing I started to realise was where they decided not to put the command structure in. And apparently this video has dropped 3.3% worth of frames, so I do apologise. I hope that's not caused any issues. But the command structure put in place, the fact that that wasn't put in, and the fact that that was directly a consequence, that no joint command structure was set up, was directly a consequence of defunding the fights, and the need to make it as cheap as possible to get it through to people like Churchill and like Wimborne, I think shows the consequences of it. We often talk about the importance of joined-up thinking. I think the whole Far East debacle, and it was a debacle from the British perspective, is a classic example of the problems of not doing enough joined-up thinking, of not thinking things through, of not developing them properly. It's a constant issue. It is a constant issue. Now, Waller's Ghost, you've put in the thing that the RN is a minor role in defence, the RF is responsible. They built 8 air bases with 1,400 aircraft. No, the Royal Air Force was never responsible really for the defence of Malaya. They talked about being responsible for the defence of Malaya. They talked a good game, They built a load of airfields they couldn't defend, and we didn't have the troops to defend, but they were never responsible for the defence of Malaysia. It was always considered Navy spheres, and the Air Force and the Army were always supposed to support it. That was the whole thing for the Far East. Even when they were putting increased aircraft there, they were always saying we're in support of the Navy. And that covered them a lot. That's why they could send the aircraft they did, because we're just there to support the Navy. We're not the primary theatre. They're just the air crews and the squadrons they sent, because we're just there to support the Navy, not we're not the primary defensive theatre. And it's the same with lots of other things. And the point was, the whole scenario had been set up that the Navy was the primary defence in a scenario where it was presumed that the Royal Navy would not be fighting in the Mediterranean and the Atlantic at the same time. Basically, the Royal Navy was told at one point to prepare for war as a one-power standard. And then they were given the 10-year, then they had a 10-year rule. And then it was a case of, okay, prepare to fight any 2. They never gave them the funding to prepare to fight any 3. Preparing to fight any 3 is a very different standard. Fighting the Japanese, the Italians and the Germans at the same time requires a far larger fleet, and it requires very different fleets, because fighting the Germans requires an escort heavy force that can deal with their submarine threat, especially once post-1941, when they really go submarine heavy, but it requires fast capital ships to begin with. The Italians, well, that's going to block off your Mediterranean supply routes to the Far East, so that's going to change your supply needs in the Far East. But before we get that, you have to work out how you're going to deal with the Mediterranean fleet. Well, that's going to require carriers, especially carriers which are able to take damage and continue, and which is one of the reasons why you get the armoured carriers. But you're also going to require battleships which can engage their capital ships, which is where you get the refitted Queen Elizabeths from, because basically the refitting of the Queen Elizabeths is all about dealing with the littorios. The King George V's are about being fast battleships to deal with the German fast battleships. The Lions are about the Far East. Now, then we get on to the Far East scenario. Well, here is the other problem, and one of the reasons why, again, the armoured carrier becomes suitable for the British in terms of the Far East. If you're looking at, because of the lack of investment in the 1920s and the scale of infrastructure development, therefore, that's taken place in the 1930s and what's available in run up to World War II and during the beginning of World War II, the British do not expect to be able to easily repair their ships out in the Far East. And if they get damaged, they're going to have to build new ones, and they're going to have to go a long way to go, especially if they're having to go around the Mediterranean, which is why you have the armoured carriers. They're less likely to take damage and easier to repair. And that is the entire reason for it, and why when people start to tell me that the armoured carriers are not designed for the Far East, I sit there and laugh at them. Because I sit there and go, no, they're not designed for the Far East on terms of the metrics of the Americans or the Japanese. But if you're looking at the British metrics in terms of what they need to do, they need to have a carrier available. There's an argument over, well, it should have more aircraft. Well, A, it can carry more aircraft when you do deck parking, and you don't do deck parking in the North Sea and North Atlantic because you'll lose your aircraft. But B, the big thing is the Royal Navy make a choice of, is it better to have a carrier that's on the bottom of the ocean because you can't repair and maintain it and not useful, or better to have a carrier which has less aircraft but you can actually will have it available to operate? They decide to have the carrier which has less aircraft. Well, a Japanese study said that 10 infantry divisions were required to invade Australia, and they didn't have 10 infantry divisions available. Honestly, I would say 10 divisions versus the emus would win. But seriously, I think the Japanese never had the forces to get to Australia. They were of course threatening it and trying to posture like they did, but they never had the forces to get to Australia. Students at GP, your plan seems solid, but where are the potential places where things could have gone wrong for the Allies within the framework? Oh, MacArthur versus the 5-star. There's going to be two people, they're going to be arguing, and it's going to be an entirely political fight. If Canadian troops aren't wiped out in Hong Kong, fighting Malaysia instead, could be an interesting twist to Canadian history and experience on Far East. It could be interesting if they're in there, but honestly, again, what would a commander-in-chief Far East might go, well, hang on, why are we defending the whole of Malaysia? Let's just build a defence line, have scouts ahead. And also the other thing is, if you have someone in that position, you have someone who's going to turn around to the RAF and go, why are you building bases we can't defend? Explain. Because we're going to put aircraft in them. Where are the aircraft? Not available. Okay, build bases for the aircraft you have. Have each of those bases have a surge capacity. Don't build any more bases until you have more aircraft. And more troops to defend them. Okay. Right then, I'm going to say any questions. And I'm going to say I'm going to guarantee this for hopefully another 25 minutes. But we are up to now 3.5% of drop frames. And I think the poor satellite link is overloading. And I can hear more voices behind me. Poor Fluff. I think the Fluff's worried, I'm not sure. And I am wondering if that was a reaction to the drugs he's had to take for his flea drugs. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I'm going to have a chat with him about that and find out. Okay. Poor Elon. Elon's done very well. So far today, he's done all my work and he's done all my sister's work. Thank you everyone for watching. I've got a long patrol ready to go up for Saturday. I will give a heads up now that Sunday's video might be a premiere, key ships premiere. It might be a live, because it's going to depend on trains and where exactly I end up at certain points. So if it changes suddenly to a premiere, you know why, it's trains. A premiere which I might actually record tomorrow evening. Would have seen more Ark Royal light carriers being built for the Far East. The Ark Royal wasn't built for the Far East. It was built for the strike carrier role. And the Royal Navy only needed to build one of those because they already had Courageous and Glorious for the role. So their replacements for Courageous and Glorious were Indefatigable and Implacable and Indefatigable. So that's their sort of replacements coming up. They needed a certain amount of strike carriers. They needed a certain number of fleet carriers for their roles. And basically, they would have built all of them. All their carriers would have been Implacables if they'd had the tonnage allowance to do it. But the thing is, the Royal Navy needed a certain number of carriers to have enough in the Far East Mediterranean for all the different operations they needed to do. So you built for the infrastructure. What capability does Australia have for construction? Probably they can build their own destroyers, cruisers, and anything else themselves, actually. Probably they had the capacity to be building full-size cruisers. I have to say that my strong suspicion is that you end up with a fight in the Coral Sea between whatever forces are available from the US Navy, the Royal Navy, and the Japanese at some point early in 1942. That's what I think, because if you consider it, that's going to be a key point for the British and the Americans and combined air forces. I might do a video about YouTube Christmas dinners for sailors on ships. Now, Sarah, would you agree that Australian governments, and I'm translating this, can only blame themselves for the fact that not investing in industry to retain the skill needed to build ships? I would say, yeah, but they're going to try and blame everyone else, but that's because politicians always try and blame other people. But basically, the entire Collins-class saga, the current issues with the Hunter-class and all these things can be put down to the fact that they haven't invested enough to maintain their own industry and infrastructure. A UAD vid tomorrow, Friday, might not be possible. It's going to depend where I am. If I am in the right place at the right time, there will be a UAD vid. If I am not, then it will be not happening. Sure, not the subject to talk about today, but I've really started getting the UAD, and when flash fires happen, turrets pop off like they are T-72s in Rush from Space Program. Yeah, they do. I've done some videos on things, and yeah, that is to an extent how they work, because if you have an entire magazine go boom, the turret can go airborne. What does this mean post-war for the Royal Navy and Royal Australian Navy procurement strategy? It's going to depend what happens in the war. I can tell you what sort of happens. I've had the war break out roughly the same time, because it probably still would, because it wouldn't change those factors. But it's going to depend how the war goes. And the thing is, if you've had a joined up command structure for about 10 years in the Far East, how's that going to have affected cooperation between the Navy and the Army and the Air Force in the Mediterranean and in other theatres in Britain, because the British have been fighting in? So all those things will have an impact. Who loses more if London Treaty limits carriers to 24,500 tons standard displacement limit? America. Japan to an extent, but America more. So, is Tuesday's video just gone, going to be aired? Because I was looking forward to that. It went out last night. It went up late because it took so long to upload. I started uploading that at 9 a.m. I think it was. I don't know. Not 9 a.m. I tell a lie. It was finished editing, etc. It started uploading about 10 a.m. It didn't finish its upload till... And it went live about 9 p.m. I think. So it's this instead of Midway? Potentially. Yeah, potentially. Potentially that happen. Potentially you have a combined Anglo-American carrier force and probably British capital ships, because they'll be coming from closer. Have an action against them. I don't know, why did the US and Japan lose the carriers set up 24,500 tons of limited LNT? Because both of them want to build the largest carriers they can possibly for that, and they need them for their strike plans. So they want to build them as big as they can do. Whereas the British want to build... The British are always dividing theirs up to try and work out how to get 6. You're supposed to get 5 27,000 ton carriers from 135,000 tons. The British want 6 carriers, which is why they end up with 22.5 to 23,000 tons. And the Lexington conversions will probably still be alive, but are allowed, but they're going to rock up even more tonnage. And the thing is, if you're going for an Alpha Strike carrier formation, which is going to launch these big strikes as a focus, then it needs to be a big strike as a focus. If Renown class was built with the armour of the Renge class and a triple 15-inch guns, could it keep the same amount of boilers to hit 20 knots or even 30 knots, or would they need more? You probably need slightly more with the boilers at a time, but not that much more. Your main issue is going to be, if you consider how much longer and the hull is, and how much bigger the hull is, the weight differential that's going to stresses that's going to introduce into the hull. A Tiger hull converted into a carrier would be, it would be interesting. It would be interesting. Honestly, on the Battleship Nagato issue, I'm not going to get involved in that because I've only read a couple of books. I would need to do more reading before I answer that. I try to answer that question. Take care, Tanif. Alright then. As the questions appear to be drying up, and as I want to go and get something, I can't think what, in a washing machine, quickly, I'm going to say thank you very much, everyone. What have I got coming up? We have 21st century sea power in reimagining cable and corvette. We have a Japanese battleship being covered in tomorrow's tomorrow's key ships. And next week's patron is Everything a Scharnhorst. Journey analyzes on one hull for capital ships and carriers. John say, thank you, Doctor, and good night. And small off-topic question: what is the result of either the following named warfight? Any car, land on naval base aircraft, C3, G3, N3, F3 class submarines. Submarines, we've had a warspite. We've now got another warspite coming, which is an SSBN. I'm suitably scared. F3 named warspite. That's going to be scary for anyone. G3 or N3 named it. That's going to be a mind of its own and a lot of explosions. My car is actually named Warsprite, the original spelling of Warspite. And, yeah, I'm not sure about land naval based aircraft. Otherwise, it's all fun. Magnus, what would fish do if Courageous Class limited 9.2-inch guns? Have a fit, but honestly, probably be quite proud of them in the end, because you could probably put 2, even 4 triple turret, 9.2-inch turrets on those displacements, in which case you'd have some jolly good cruisers. And that would probably have changed the interwar period, because those might have been the basis for cruisers. Thank you, Blackman Maximus. Thank you, Mark Harkness. Thank you, Runon. Thank you, DG40. Thank you, Jens Morrison. Thank you, David Golding. Who was the sponsor of the newest Daring? I cannot remember off the top of my head. Thank you, Stephen Richards. Thank you, Steve Clark. Thank you, Just Funk. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Baron Newman. And thank you very much, everyone. Take care. And thank you. Oh, they wouldn't call the Type 83 Jackie Fisher class. He doesn't have that much political support anymore. Thank you, Dirt Squad. Thank you, everyone.